When everything gets cheap enough that winning becomes easy, nobody really wins. For decades, China's rise looked like it couldn't be stopped. The world's factory was built on efficiency so ruthless it almost felt like an art form. Cities that never slept. Assembly lines glowing through the night. Prices falling like clockwork, year after year, until Western competitors finally stopped trying. It was a miracle built on scale, discipline, and planning, a civilization turning human labor into raw economic horsepower. But every miracle carries a price. And China's biggest strength, the ability to make things cheaper, faster, and larger than anyone else, has slowly become the very force dragging it downward. Welcome to Economic Story, where money, power, and history collide, and where nothing is ever as simple as it first appears. China's story is modern capitalism stretched right up to its breaking point. A system that rewards growth at any cost, even when those costs destroy the future it relies on. What happens when the world's manufacturing giant optimizes itself into exhaustion, when efficiency eventually turns into self-destruction? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning of the economic miracle. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping stood before the Communist Party and challenged one of socialism's deepest taboos. He told China that getting rich wasn't shameful, it was patriotic. And with that, he set loose one of the fastest economic transformations the world had ever witnessed. Almost overnight, peasants turned into entrepreneurs. Farmland became factory space. Foreign investors, first from Japan, then the United States, and later Europe, saw nothing but opportunity. Cheap labor, endless manpower, and a government eager to strike deals. China opened several special economic zones, small experimental cities where the rules changed. No rigid central planning, less bureaucracy, no ideological purity tests, just one mission. Bring in capital and produce exports. And it worked better than anyone expected. Shenzhen, a quiet fishing village of 30,000 people, exploded into a massive city of millions. Within 20 years, the formula spread everywhere. Every province wanted its own boom. Every city wanted to become the next Shenzhen. Local governments borrowed heavily and built highways, power plants, and industrial parks, all to attract more factories. By the early 2000s, China wasn't simply growing, it was swallowing global demand for almost everything. Steel, coal, copper, oil. Any Western company that hoped to survive moved production there. If something could be manufactured, sooner or later it would come from China. But beneath that unstoppable rise lay a dangerous incentive. Success meant being cheaper than everyone else. Local governments competed for factories by slashing land prices, lowering taxes, and suppressing wages. Companies fought by cutting margins, quality, and profits. Everyone chased growth. Almost nobody chased sustainability. It was a race to the bottom, disguised as progress. For a long time, it didn't seem to matter. The machine was too powerful. Workers poured in from the countryside, millions each year, ready to work 12-hour days for a fraction of Western wages. Factories ran non-stop. Ports never rested. Western consumers got their miracle, the $5 t-shirt, the $300 iPhone, the illusion of endless abundance without inflation. And China became wealthy. But somewhere between the 10th new shopping mall and the 100th steel mill, the system began to overheat. The miracle slowly turned into an addiction. Local governments needed growth to repay the loans they had taken to build those factories. So they built even more. By 2015, China's steel capacity alone exceeded the rest of the world combined. Entire industrial regions were producing goods faster than global demand could ever absorb them. Prices began to drop, not because of innovation, but out of desperation. Factories didn't slow down when profits vanished. They sped up, hoping volume would save them. It didn't. That's when a new phrase began circulating, borrowed from human behavior but now describing an entire economy: involution. Involution isn't only about people working harder for less. It's about companies producing more for less, competition that stops being about innovation and turns entirely into survival. In the past, the word involution meant Chinese students or workers driving themselves to exhaustion while the rewards kept shrinking. But now it's industrial. It's systemic. An entire sector is trapped in a zero-sum battle for market share where the last remaining weapon is price. Solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, all symbols of China's new economy, have become the battlefield. Dozens of firms, many backed by the state, flooded markets with nearly identical products, each one cutting prices to underbid the next. Margins disappeared, yet nobody dared stop. In a system where legitimacy equals output, losing production means losing face. And so the cycle keeps feeding itself. Companies slash prices to protect market share. Rivals match them. Profits collapse. Wages freeze. Consumers cheer for a while, until they realize that cheap abundance arrives at the cost of prosperity. China has entered an era of industrial involution, a self-destructive loop where efficiency devours profit and production devours purpose. It isn't a race to innovate anymore, it's a race to the bottom. And like every race to the bottom, nobody actually wins. This is why China's solar panels sell below cost, why electric vehicles pile up in lots waiting for buyers, why tech giants fight over the same shrinking domestic demand even as their valuations sink. And it's why, despite record exports, industrial profits dropped more than 20% in 2024. When everyone competes to be the cheapest, price becomes the only thing left that can fall. That isn't capitalism in overdrive. It's capitalism consuming itself. And here's the irony, China has seen this before. In the 2000s, when overproduction in coal and steel crushed prices, Beijing was forced to intervene, cutting capacity, shutting mines, merging plants, and laying off hundreds of thousands of workers. It was economic triage, short-term pain to avoid total collapse. 2 decades later, it's happening again, except this time, the patient isn't one industry. It's the entire growth model. Factories don't close because spreadsheets say they should. They close only when politics allows it. And in China, politics does not reward contraction, it rewards movement, even if that movement simply runs in circles. Behind closed doors, party officials see the numbers, falling profits, flat wages, rising debt. But in public, the message doesn't change. Keep producing. Keep growing. Keep believing. Because if the machine stops, the illusion stops with it. By the 2020s, China's efficiency machine had morphed into something else entirely, an economy locked in an arms race against itself. From the outside, it still looked like triumph, record exports, gleaming factories, and a pipeline of electric cars and solar panels big enough to power continents. But inside, margins were collapsing. The miracle had stopped creating wealth. It was merely recycling it, faster and thinner, every year. Economists call this overcapacity. But in China, overcapacity isn't a bug. It's policy. Take solar. In 2023 alone, China produced more than twice the world's total demand for panels. Prices dropped nearly 40% in a single year. Companies sold below cost just to clear inventory. Dozens of smaller firms went bankrupt, yet the giants kept producing because local governments needed the jobs, the output, and the appearance of progress. Now look at electric vehicles. More than 100 Chinese EV brands are competing for the same shrinking domestic market. Each cuts prices to survive, pushing others to match. The government steps in with subsidies to prevent mass layoffs, but subsidies only feed the loop: more supply, lower prices, thinner margins. You can see where this leads. In the first half of 2024, industrial profits fell over 20%, even while exports stayed strong. Factories are shipping more goods than ever, and earning less on every one of them. Growth continues, but the quality of that growth erodes from within. Here's the twist: not all of this is accidental. Part of it is designed. China's government has long practiced weaponized efficiency, using subsidies to keep key sectors alive long enough to wipe out competitors. It's not about quarterly profits. It's about strategic monopoly. In industries like solar panels, batteries, and EVs, Beijing is willing to lose money now to control the future. Local governments pour billions into plants, cheap loans, and tax breaks so companies can sell below cost, not merely to survive, but to eliminate rivals. The logic is ruthless: flood the market, undercut everyone, and wait. Western firms tied to shareholders and short-term profits can't keep pace. They fold. And once the global supply chain depends on Chinese output, China can do what monopolies always do: raise prices, dictate terms, and dominate the value chain. The playbook isn't new. It's the same strategy used with steel, rare earths, and shipbuilding. In each case, China underpriced the world until the world had no alternative. But this time, the scale is unlike anything before. These aren't the industrial commodities of yesterday. They're the raw materials of what's ahead. Lithium batteries, solar cells, electric drivetrains, the arteries feeding the 21st century economy. On paper, it looks brilliant. In reality, it's fragile, because there's only so long an empire can bleed money, even strategically, before the system starts to decay. When every industry assumes the government will absorb the losses, efficiency turns into a habit you can't quit. Companies stop competing through innovation and begin competing for subsidies. Productivity shifts into politics. And the boundary between national strategy and national liability starts fading. That's the danger hidden behind China's price wars. They aren't merely economic contests. They're fiscal time bombs. Money spent today just to keep factories alive gets borrowed from tomorrow's stability. Eventually, somebody has to cover the bill. And that's what makes this version of the China trap so tragic. The very strategy that once let China dominate markets now threatens to consume its own economy from the inside. Because power built on losses isn't victory, it's collapse delayed. It isn't the fall in demand that destroys an empire. It's the collapse of purpose. And here, purpose has been swapped for momentum, a system that can't risk slowing down because every layer depends on constant motion. Local governments need factories running to service their debts. State banks need those factories borrowing to justify their balance sheets. And the central government needs all of them active to preserve the illusion of full employment. If any link in the chain snaps, the rest starts coming apart. So everyone keeps pretending that more output still equals more prosperity, even when it clearly doesn't anymore. This is the political logic of state capitalism. Production proves control. When growth weakens, the state doesn't step back, it builds another factory. When prices fall, it pushes them lower. When private businesses hesitate, local governments step in with more credit. The cure for every imbalance becomes more of the same imbalance. It isn't irrational, it's survival. Because China's economy isn't only an engine of wealth, it's an engine of legitimacy. Its social contract has one clause: keep growing, and the people will keep believing. That worked when growth lifted incomes. It fails when growth merely makes goods cheaper. The paradox is brutal. China's industrial overproduction keeps global inflation low, yet it suppresses its own wages and demand. The nation that lifted hundreds of millions from poverty now struggles to improve the living standards of those already lifted. And the more China exports deflation, the more delicate the global system becomes. In the West, cheap Chinese goods once looked like a blessing, holding down inflation, stocking shelves, making middle-class life affordable. But that same abundance now exports fragility. Western factories can't compete. Developing nations can't build industries. And the global price of cheap becomes stagnation. China didn't invent this trap. History did. The pattern is as old as empires. Britain's coal industry once flooded the world's markets. Prices fell so far that even British miners couldn't earn a living. The answer back then was colonies, captive markets created to soak up the surplus. Japan's economic miracle of the 1980s ran into the same barrier: too much capacity, falling prices, and an aging society that simply stopped spending. Rome's decline, interestingly, didn't begin with invasion, it began with overproduction. Huge estates run by slaves produced so much grain that prices collapsed and small farmers, the republic's backbone, went bankrupt. Rome fed itself straight into imbalance. Every empire that perfects efficiency eventually confronts the same question: can it pause optimization long enough to actually survive? China's leaders see this clearly. That's why they talk constantly about rebalancing, moving from investment-driven growth toward consumption. But rebalancing requires time. And time is the one resource a growth-addicted system never has. So even while Beijing tries to steer toward innovation and consumer demand, local provinces keep building more factories, more infrastructure, more output, because their incentives still point that way. It's like trying to go on a diet while the kitchen is still cooking non-stop. The irony is that many of China's most overproduced products, batteries, EVs, solar panels, are exactly what the world needs for the energy transition. Yet when prices crash and firms collapse, even green revolutions stall. The world benefits from cheaper tech, but at the expense of China's own profitability. Cheap abundance becomes a trap, not because it fails to create wealth, but because it erases the motivation to create more. And once that happens, efficiency flips from virtue into illness. China's problem isn't too little productivity, it's too much. An empire that mastered production has lost its balance, a system able to flood the globe with goods but unable to generate enough demand to keep them profitable. There's a harsh symmetry in that. The very force that made China wealthy, ruthless competition, now guarantees nobody can relax long enough to stay wealthy. This is what happens when growth becomes identity. When production replaces purpose. When progress is measured only by how much cheaper you can make things that no one needs more of. That isn't development, it's evolution on an industrial scale. And, like the empires before it, China is discovering that nothing costs more than being too cheap. Because when a system optimizes everything except balance, eventually the only thing left to destroy is itself. If this shifted your perspective, hit subscribe. History holds the answers, and I'll show you where to find them.